Hello and welcome to In Summary. Kenya is on edge. What started as protests against a controversial financial bill has now turned into a national crisis. With deadly clashes, enforced disappearances, and mass demonstrations led by Kenya's Gen Z, this marks one of the most turbulent moments in the country's recent history, and what comes next for a nation demanding change. Kenya has been gripped by one of the most significant waves of civil unrest in its recent history. What began as a call for justice for the suspicious death of a whistleblowing teacher in police custody rapidly evolved into a nationwide protest movement led predominantly by young Kenyans demanding sweeping reforms. The catalyst for the unrest was the death of Albert Omondi Ojwang, a former schoolteacher and blogger who had gained online attention for exposing alleged corruption and abuse within the Kenyan police force. Ojwang was arrested in early June and died just 2 days later whilst in custody. Authorities claimed he had taken his own life, but an independent autopsy revealed signs of torture and blunt force trauma, igniting public outrage. His death struck a nerve, particularly among young people who had grown disillusioned with what they see as systemic injustice and unchecked state power. As word spread on social media under the hashtag Justice for Ojwang, protests began to build. However, they quickly expanded beyond the single incident. The demonstrations tapped into broader frustrations: the rising cost of living, high youth unemployment, widespread corruption, and increased authoritarianism under the government of President William Ruto. Many young Kenyans, including university students, digital activists, and unemployed graduates, began organising demonstrations across major cities. By the first week of July, momentum had grown rapidly, especially in the run-up to Sabasaba Day, July the 7th, a symbolic anniversary commemorating Kenya's pro-democracy movement in the 1990s. Organisers used the date to rally protesters in what became the largest coordinated anti-government demonstrations since Ruto's administration began. Major urban centres, including Nairobi, saw tens of thousands march peacefully. However, tensions quickly escalated. Kenyan police and security forces responded forcefully. The government had issued a zero-tolerance directive in the days leading up to the Sabasaba protests, warning that any public gathering deemed unlawful would be met with strict action. On the day of the protest, roads in and out of major cities were barricaded. Protesters were met with tear gas, water cannons, and rubber bullets, and in some cases, live ammunition.
Is this what we are going to go through every day? We are youth. We don't have jobs. We don't have anything to live for. You've taken away everything we have. Everything we need to live for. You've taken it all away. What do you want us to do? What do you want us to do? We are tired.
Human rights groups documented at least 10 deaths, though some reports place the number even higher, with hundreds more injured or arrested. One of the most shocking aspects of the crackdown was the abduction of protest leaders by men in plain clothes, widely suspected to be members of the police or security forces. Eyewitnesses and footage shared online showed individuals being dragged into unmarked cars, sparking further outrage.
President Ruto is a half-term president. There is no president who has intimidated us in his first term. Ruto must go.
At the same time, access to independent media and internet services were reportedly restricted in parts of the country, prompting accusations of censorship and digital repression. The government defended its actions by claiming the protests had been infiltrated by violent elements and that the response was necessary to maintain law and order. However, many civil society groups, religious leaders, and international observers condemned the heavy-handed tactics. Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch both issued statements criticizing the use of force and apparent targeting of peaceful protesters. A particularly notable feature of the July 2025 protests was the role of Kenya's Gen Z. Young people led the way, not only in numbers, but in strategy. Social media platforms like TikTok, X, and Instagram were flooded with real-time updates, protest guides, safety tips, and even emotional appeals for unity and change. Many saw the movement as a generational turning point, a sign that Kenya's youth were no longer willing to be sidelined in national affairs. Meanwhile, pressure began to mount on President Ruto, whose administration was already facing criticism over economic stagnation and rising inflation. Protesters began chanting "Ruto must go" at rallies and on social media.
I have tried to listen to the people organizing the demonstrations, and they have said three things. They have said they love Kenya, but they hate the leaders. And they have talked something about one term. And they have said Ruto must go. Those are the things I have listened to, you know? And therefore, I want to ask them this, because if you truly love Kenya, as you say, don't ban your country.
The opposition expressed solidarity with the protesters, though some youth leaders warned against the co-opting of the movement by political elites. As the protests entered their second week, more towns joined the demonstrations, and the tone of the movement shifted from grief and outrage to a firm demand for systemic change. Protesters called for an independent inquiry into Ojwang's deaths, accountability for police violence, and broader reforms in governance and public service delivery. In response to growing international concern, the Kenyan government eventually announced that an independent commission would investigate the death of Ojwang and the conduct of security forces during the July protests. However, many activists expressed skepticism, pointing to previous investigations that yielded no tangible reforms. By mid-July, although the streets had begun to quiet, the impact of the protests was still rippling through Kenyan society. A number of youth coalitions and civil society organisations began laying plans for long-term political engagement, including voter registration drives and civic education campaigns. The July 2025 protests, whilst costly in human lives and marked by violence, were widely seen as a defining moment for a new generation of Kenyans. The protests were not just a reaction to a single tragic event. They were a broader indictment of the status quo, a demand from young Kenyans for justice, transparency, and a government that listens. While the road ahead remains uncertain, the message from Kenya's streets is unmistakably clear. Change is not just coming, it's being demanded.